books help us escape. They help us feel like we're still growing and we're not going backwards. They help us understand our history, our humanity. And like this book did, it gives you hope about humanity and how resilient humanity is. I want to, so Patrick's best-selling book, Say Nothing, A True Story of Murder, Memory, in Northern Ireland did that for me. Patrick was born in Dorchester, Mass., Columbia undergrad. He was a history major. He then went to Yale Law School for a degree. His mistake was, I told him earlier, he should have gone to Columbia, and then he could have lived in International House as a grad student and be even more evolved than he is now. He went on to Cambridge for a degree in international relations and then the London School of Economics. Patrick was a fellow and got many fellowships, but the one I'm going to highlight is he was a George Marshall Fellow, and George Marshall was a chair of International House, so there's a good connection there. Patrick is a staff writer for the New Yorker, and I've already downloaded your next two of your other books, Chatter, which is about global eavesdropping, and this one's trickier, Snakehead, which I sort of boiled down, the undercover underworld of a multi-million-dollar people smuggling operation run out of a noodle shop in Chinatown. So all of Patrick's books are based on true stories, but his thorough research and the way he writes, they are all like gripping mysteries. And if you haven't read his books, please go out and buy them. So I'm going to start with my first question, Patrick. You got your idea for this book from an obituary. Tell me how that happened and how that got you into this story.
Sure. Thank you, Peter, for that great introduction, and thank you to all of you. I just wish I could be joining you in person. As Peter mentioned, I went to Columbia for my undergraduate, and really they were 4 of the happiest years of my life, and so I never miss an opportunity to come back. And when we initially talked about this, I thought I was going to be there in person, and I was looking forward to coming back and visiting my old haunts in Morningside Heights. So hopefully the next time it will be in person. But for now, I'm really appreciative that you all are joining us virtually. Yeah, so this, it's funny, you would think with my very Irish name that I might have had some prior connection to the Troubles or the I.R.A. or any of the topics covered in this book, but I really didn't. My father's family came from Ireland about 100 years ago. And so I grew up in Boston in a very Irish American community, but without any real sense of tangible connection to Ireland or to the Troubles for that matter. I came to this story just in the context of my day job at the New Yorker. I'm always looking for interesting stories. And one of the places that I look for them is the obituary page. My father is a great reader of the obituary page. It's the first thing that he reads in the newspaper every morning. Other people might read the front section or flip to the sports pages. My dad goes right to the obituary page. He calls it the Irish sports pages. So he likes to start the day by reading about all the people who've just died. And I picked this habit up from him. And in 2013, it's hard to believe it's 7 years ago, I read an obituary of a woman I had never heard of before, a woman named Dolores Price. I've got the book here, and I'll show you. This is her photo on the cover of the book. It was not a name I knew. She was a fairly well-known figure in Northern Ireland, but not here in the States. And she was a member of the Irish Republican Army. So she grew up in an I.R.A. family. For those of you who don't have much context in the Troubles, the island of Ireland today is 26 counties in the Republic, and then 6 counties that are part of the UK. in the North. And she grew up in the North with an understanding that if you're Irish, your job is to expel the British by any means necessary. And so the idea of this woman who was really on the front lines of the Troubles in the 1970s was very intriguing to me.
And Patrick, one of the interesting things to me is that she was not a very she became radicalized later in some, in to a big extent, but she wasn't, by her personality sound, very radical. But what happened, into the Troubles was, as we were having the, Selma to Montgomery march, there was a civil rights movement that started with the Republicans in Northern Ireland. And talk about how she was on a march from Belfast to Londonderry, and what happened to her, and how that sort of changed possibly her trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this was one of the things I found really fascinating, was that this is a woman who, when she was a young girl, she grew up in this family in which, both of her parents had been to prison for the cause of Irish republicanism. She had relatives on both sides, going back generations, who'd been involved in this push to violently expel the British out of Ireland. And so when she was an adolescent in the 60s, she rebelled. But in that family, what it meant to rebel was to say, what if we gave peace a chance? What if we tried something different here? And this happened to coincide with the civil rights movement in the United States. And this is something I had not known, naively, as an American, was that there was a movement in the late 1960s in Northern Ireland to try and achieve better civil rights for Catholics. Catholics were systematically excluded from good jobs, good housing, political power in Northern Ireland. And they were very much inspired by the US civil rights movement. They really studied the Selma March. They studied Dr. King and the tactics and the strategies of African-American nonviolent civil rights protesters. And so Dolores Price and her sister, her younger sister, go on this march in 1969 from Belfast to Derry, which is another city, sort of the second city in Northern Ireland. And it was a 4-day march, and the whole idea was peaceful protest. And on the 4th day, they were about to get into Derry when they were ambushed. And this was mostly students marching. And you had a group of people who came down, dozens of them, from a hill, who were loyalists. They were loyal to the British crown. They resented this march. And they beat the sisters, and they beat the other marchers. And this experience, I think, kind of disabused the sisters pretty early of this idea that that they would make a go of it with nonviolent protest.
So when I was last night, I found your original tweet announcing your book, and you wrote, I wrote a book about the intersecting lives of a handful of people in Belfast in Northern Ireland during the long conflict known as the Troubles. So the other, and this is a much sadder case. Will you talk about Jean McConville and what happened and that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's another big figure in the book. There are several big characters, and another one of the big ones is this woman, Jean McConville. Also a woman in Belfast in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, but with a very, very different experience. She was a Protestant woman who married a Catholic man. They lived in East Belfast, which was quite Protestant. They had 10 children, which sounds like a lot of kids, but actually at the time in Northern Ireland was not all that unusual. And they ended up getting hounded out of East Belfast because they were kind of too Catholic, because the husband was Catholic, for this Protestant neighborhood. And they moved to West Belfast, very Irish Catholic neighborhood. And there was some suspicion of them there. And her husband died of cancer. And so suddenly she's widowed. She's got these 10 kids to take care of. She was living in a big kind of hulking housing project in West Belfast, quite a scary place. And one night in December 1972, there's a knock on the door. She's at home with the kids. A gang of masked intruders comes in. Some of them were armed. And they said to the children, we just need to talk to your mother. We're going to take her away for a few hours. We'll bring her back. We just want to talk to her. And they dragged her out of the apartment with the kids clinging to her legs. And the kids never saw her again. She disappeared. And this became a very iconic case in Northern Ireland. There may be people watching right now who are from countries where disappearances, forced disappearances, have been much more commonplace. If you think about places like Chile or Argentina, or Spain or Cambodia, I mean, this has happened a lot. In Northern Ireland, there weren't that many disappearances over the course of the Troubles, forced disappearances, but this was perhaps the most famous. Jean McConville was never seen again. She's buried in a secret grave, and it turned out she was killed by the I.R.A. But her children grew up orphaned, not knowing what had happened to her. And the kind of seed for me, the beginning of this project, was when I was reading that obituary that you mentioned of Dolores Price. It mentioned that she might have had something to do with the abduction and murder of Jean McConville. So for me, it was this idea of these two very different women with very different experiences, one of them a victim and one of them a perpetrator, who were linked by this terrible act of violence in 1972.
The kids, kept on. I looked on the YouTube. They advocated, and so you helped bring some closure to them, I would think, in this whole process.
I hope. I mean, I think it's hard. I think they have lived very, very difficult lives. Orphaned at a young age. The younger ones were distributed to pretty terrible orphanages in Northern Ireland. They grew up, some of them thinking their mother would come home because they didn't have the closure of a grave that they could go to. They did, long before I started my book, they did in 2003 find their mother. Her body was discovered buried in a grave by a beach. And they were able to rebury her and have a place to go to mourn her.
So I had a question. Seamus Heaney, the Nobel Prize winning poet, you based your title on his poem, which you can actually see. He reads it on YouTube. I found it last night, which just makes you want to cry. It's so good. And it's whatever you say nothing. Were you at all worried that you went to Northern Ireland 7 times? You're stirring up and asking a lot of questions. Were you ever worried that if you raised something or stirred something up that it could lead to someone getting hurt? Or did that ever, when you were over, did you ever worry about that?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I don't, there was no way. I'll tell you, one of the most striking things for me about this story, and some of this was my learning curve as an outsider and as an American. I mean, I think there is a very specifically American way of looking at the world in which it's very forward looking. You're always thinking about the future. The future is always kind of consuming the past. And I think I may have underestimated when I first started going to Northern Ireland the extent to which the past still rules the present and kind of governs the future. And so when I showed up, I thought naively that if I started knocking on doors and asking about a murder that happened before I was born, in 1972, that it would feel kind of, it would feel like a black and white film reel. It would feel like a kind of musty old sepia-tone story. And what I found is that it was just electric and dangerous. And you could see the fear in people's eyes when you asked about it. And there was a real sense that, this isn't the past at all. It's playing out right now. So what that meant for me was that I had to be, I think, sensitive to, I didn't want to get anybody killed. I didn't want to get anybody in any huge amount of trouble. I wasn't overly worried about myself. I mean, I sometimes get this question, and I think the worst that might have happened to me is I might have gotten roughed up a little, but I didn't worry about anybody breaking my legs or anything. It was more that I have, as an outsider, who lives in New York, I had this luxury, which is that I could go there and stir things up and then get on a plane and come home. And so that was more my concern was, I don't want to create any undue problems for people who live here, and who have to live in this place with these people.
Well, I think, from the way one of the things is, if you haven't read the book, your thoroughness, and this is all the references, and you're really telling a mystery, but you're very thorough, and you're very, our values for International House are respect, empathy, and moral courage. And I think for all these characters, and even the Price sisters who, did major bombings in England and around where people were hurt, you really walked the line of, showing respect to how someone's experience could lead them to do that without, but also showing the, walking the line of trying to deal with these moral ambiguities that are so difficult. And before I go on to another question, one of the things that I just found fascinating is that your parents still read all of your work before almost anyone else sees that. And tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I don't, when I was a kid, I would write things and give them to my parents to read, and it never really, I'm in my 40s now, and it never really changed. They still, they still read everything I do and have all kinds of helpful feedback. And I'm very close to my parents. And my mother is she's retired now, but she was a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and has written a bunch of books herself. And my dad has some of the, he's got the Irish storytelling facility. And so they've always been a really helpful sounding board for me. And I'm happy. I feel lucky that they still can be.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I'm going to go on. I got a real treat last night because our fellow trustee, Joan Gregory, emailed me last night. When she was a resident, she was asked to introduce Jerry Adams to the House, who is another one of these intersecting major characters in your book. And what I liked, what Joan wrote was he gave a very reserved speech, which I think is a segue to your experience with him in the book. Do you want to talk about Jerry Adams and his reserve?
Yeah, he may have been more reserved with me. Yeah, I mean, Jerry Adams is another big character in this book, and I think he's a very fascinating historical figure. When you were talking about the values of International House, that resonates with me a lot, and I'm glad to think that you saw some of that approach in the book, because part of what I wanted to do, the troubles, and I'm sure there are many other conflicts that you could say this about. It's a very vexed topic in which a lot of the writing tends to have one point of view or another. And if you talk to people who are really familiar with Jerry Adams as a historical figure, it's pretty stunning the degree to which you'll talk to some people who think that he's like a Mandela-like figure who should have won the Nobel Prize, just a great kind of unambiguously good human being. And you talk to other people who think he is the devil incarnate, and no redeeming qualities whatsoever, who should spend the rest of his life in jail. And part of what I was trying to do with the book, with Dolores Price and Jerry Adams and all these figures, was kind of complicate the things that people might think they know or feel about them. And so Adams, for those of you who are not familiar, is probably the most famous face of Irish republicanism. A guy who joined the I.R.A. when he was young, and then became the kind of head of the political wing of the I.R.A. and steered the organization to the negotiating table and this incredible peace deal in 1998 in which the troubles end. And I think Gerry Adams deserves a great deal of credit for having done that. But there's a few interesting aspects to this. One of them is that if Adams were with us this evening, and I'm sure it would have been the same thing in the reserved remarks he gave in the past, you know, he would sort of get a very earnest look on his face and look out at you and say, well, you know, this is all a big misunderstanding because I was never in the I.R.A. myself. I was only ever in the political wing. I wasn't in the I.R.A. And this is a lie. And everybody knows it's a lie. It's kind of a joke in Northern Ireland, but he persists even now in this suggestion that he was never on the front lines. He was only ever a political advocate. The other big irony with Adams that I think is really interesting, and what became a kind of a sort of an engine for the story that I wanted to tell, is that Dolores Price and people like her, when they joined the I.R.A. in the 1970s, you know, they did some awful, awful things, really barbaric things. And they, you know, putting bombs in public places, killing people. And they did those things, I think, not because they were psychopaths, but because they had a sense, they had a political calculation, which might be different than the one you would make or I would make, but a moral and political calculation that there was a means to an end. And if they did these things, they would achieve what generations of Irish Republicans had always wanted to do, which is force the British out of Ireland once and for all, reunify Ireland. And the interesting thing about the peace agreement in 98 is that that's not what happens. The conflict ends and it's a compromise. And British dominion over the North persists. And Adams signed off on that deal. And so part of what was very fascinating for me from a kind of moral and philosophical point of view is that people like Dolores Price were furious when the peace came. Not necessarily because she wanted to keep fighting forever, but because she had a great deal of post-traumatic stress at that point. She was thinking about the things she did in her 20s. And she said, you know, I did all those things because I thought eventually we would arrive at a point where I could retroactively justify them because we would have achieved the thing that we wanted to achieve. And you changed the game. You know, we got a negotiated settlement at the end, a compromise. And the whole point was we didn't want to compromise. So how do I now make sense of the things I did in my youth? How do I deal with these nightmares that I have? How do I think of myself as a moral actor? And as if that sense of kind of trauma and injury wasn't intense enough, as she's feeling these things, Gerry Adams, who was her commanding officer in the I.R.A., says, well, I sleep fine at night. I was never in the I.R.A. I don't have any responsibility that I have to work out with a therapist, you know, or with the bottle over what I did because I was never in the I.R.A. myself. And so that kind of dynamic between them was something I was very, very intrigued by. And just to bring it full circle, there was one incident in particular that was fascinating to me, which is that Dolores Price, at a certain point, suggests that she might have had something to do with the disappearance and murder of that woman, Jean McConville. And that the person who gave her the order to do that might have been Gerry Adams.
And Gerry Adams, one of the things that's fascinating is, do you want to talk about the Boston College archives and how, that led, to looking at a lot of these issues and led to some of the people involved in the I.R.A. who talked about their experience and led to Gerry Adams too.
Absolutely, yeah. So as I mentioned, you get this peace deal in 98. And I think, I'm sure many people watching will remember, I'm sure you remember, Peter, I mean, it felt like a miracle at the time. You had this conflict that people thought would never end. It had been going on for 30 years. And these negotiations.
I remember, when I would go to, my mom was Protestant and my dad was Catholic. And so I'm older than you are. I would go to Mass and then they would have intentions. So you'd pray for the Pope, you'd pray for whatever famine or whatever, flood or something was going on. And then they always would say, pray for peace in Northern Ireland. after like 12 years of using my political capital up praying for peace in Northern Ireland on something that I knew my relatives, lost the last battle in 1601 and had to flee the country, that to see it actually come to a peace. And I want to segue into another great iHouse moment. George Mitchell spoke at International House, and I was there. And for everyone's knowledge, George Mitchell helped broker. He would go around, and I remember he told the story in Davis Hall that he really credits the women of Northern Ireland that helped get the deal done. But everyone thought it was impossible. But the cute story is he was invited, and then he wanted to be baseball commissioner. He's owner of the Red Sox, so he was invited. 6 months earlier. The Red Sox are finally in the World Series. They're in a game where they could break the whatever. You're from Dorchester, you know all this stuff. The curse. And so the then program's director comes downstairs in whiteface and said, Senator Mitchell's refusing to come downstairs. So Bill Ruckert, who was chair at the time, we agreed that he would signal, and then we had Blackberries. He was signaling the scores to Mitchell. Mitchell was a amazing raconteur, and he kept to his deal. But he did go in and negotiate that peace. I guess I want to ask, how do you, this was another question, how do you think the peace is going to hold with Brexit? And you want to talk about what you think is happening now in Northern Ireland?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the big caveat for me would be anybody who makes a prediction to you about Brexit. It will if you take it seriously, we'll then have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. I don't think the Brexiteers know where everything's going. What was really striking for me was, if you think about this in really broad terms, you had a war. I mean, it was I think they would call it a civil disturbance. Nobody ever wanted to call it a war, but it was a war that raged for 3 decades over this line that was drawn across the island of Ireland. And in 98, you get this peace deal. And simultaneously, you have the EU, which creates this kind of amazing ambiguity, where I remember when I was young going and crossing the border from the Republic of Ireland into Northern Ireland, and there were watchtowers, there were sandbags, there were men with rifles who would check your car. It was quite scary. And what ends up happening is that border goes away. And with the EU, there's a ton of subsidies and money's getting pumped in, and you get people and goods moving back and forth over the border. And if any of you have been in recent years, you can cross the border and not know. You actually it's like the line in the center of the highway changes color, or if you look at the cell signal on your phone, the provider changes. And what Brexit proposes, in effect, is to take this line which has been erased and reinscribe it. And that, to me, is a very worrisome possibility. And I think it's interesting. It didn't go the way I thought it would go. What I was worried about was a border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, which, the idea of a kind of a hard Brexit, and that would be where the border was. And Boris Johnson ended up kind of coming up with this alternative solution with, which was instead, for customs purposes, that you would shift the border into the Irish Sea. But so the first scenario is upsetting if you're an Irish Republican, where you say, or an Irish nationalist, we don't want the Republic separated from the North in this way. The second scenario is upsetting if you're a unionist, if you're a Protestant living in the North and you don't want to feel as though you're becoming subsumed by the Republic. So you had this ambiguity before, where if you were in the North, you could be part of Ireland and part of the UK, you could be part of the EU, you could have passports for both, you could drive back and forth across the border. The madness of Brexit, in my mind, is that it took this ambiguous accommodation, which helped end a terrible, bloody conflict, and said, let's do away with that. Let's make the North choose. What's it going to be? And I don't know how it's going to end, but I do know that there's no scenario in which you get a Brexit that you would call Brexit, in which the North won't fundamentally have to choose ultimately between being part of the UK and being part of Europe. And for what it's worth, I will make one little prediction. I do think that in the fullness of time, if they're forced to make that choice, they'll choose Europe.
Well, that is interesting. I want to, I have lots more questions, but I want to be fair to the audience. So, Asia, I'm going to turn it over to you to start firing the questions from the audience for Patrick.
Okay, so far we've received 2 questions, and since we're talking about Brexit, Wendy O'Neill wants to know, how will Brexit influence Northern Ireland's future?
Well, I mean, this is the big, sort of along the lines of what I was just talking about. I don't think we know. In the near term, I think everybody is very tense, and there is a sense that a lot of these tensions that had been kind of becoming a bit more latent are now coming to the surface more. One kind of obvious question is whether there would be a return to violence. I'm sometimes asked, do you think the Troubles will come back? I really don't. I don't think the conditions that existed on the ground in the late 60s, early 70s exist on the ground today. I think people know what that was like, and they don't want to go back, the vast majority of people. But on the margins, you have seen an uptick in violence. There are these little dissident groups that have their violent campaigns, and so I think we could see more of that. Jerry Adams and Irish Republicans have suggested that they want to see a referendum. So when I mentioned earlier that the peace came and British dominion over Northern Ireland continued, there was a principle introduced, which is the principle of consent, which essentially said if at some point a majority of people vote that they do want to reunify Ireland, then we'll put it to a vote and it'll happen. You've seen a similar, there was a referendum in Scotland a number of years back on a similar question: do they want to leave the UK? And I think we could see a referendum. I think it'll happen in Scotland first, but I think we could see a referendum in Northern Ireland if you're in a situation again in which Brexit ends up kind of taking hold in a way that that might wall off the people of Northern Ireland from the benefits that they've enjoyed of being European.
See, Asia?
Actually, let me say one other thing.
Sure.
The only other kind of postscript to that I would say, just because I feel the need, I realize it's probably mostly not Americans watching, but but as an American growing up in Boston, I think was very naive and believed that for people in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, this was a very ideological kind of drape me in the flag kind of issue. I just assumed that everyone in the Republic of Ireland wanted to reunify with the North, and that all Catholics in the North would want to reunify. And I was quickly disabused of that when I spent time over there. I mean, this will sound silly to you, but just as an explanation of my own learning curve, when you talk to people, it's the pocketbook issue, right? You talk to normal people and they're thinking, what are my taxes? What are the benefits that I get? Where can I travel? What does this look like for me? It's on those types of bases that most people make these decisions, I think, and not necessarily on the basis of some sort of deeply held ideological or tribal allegiance to one side or the other.
Marsha Winchell wants to know, in books, you obviously need to edit and make choices. Why did you decide to not include much information about Loyalist paramilitaries?
It's a great question. So there are many, 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 many great books about the Troubles. And one of the things that was daunting for me as a writer when I started was that there was this huge, groaning bookshelf. I mean, in fact, like several shelves of books just down there about these issues and this history. And one of the things that I found early on was that a lot of these books were, to me as a reader, were a little bit overwhelming. So like page by page, they were fascinating, but there were almost too many stories. And part of what I wanted to do was write a book that would not read like a big comprehensive history book that told the whole story, soup to nuts, and included everything. And so, instead what I wanted to do was write a book that would feel as you were reading it more like a novel. Peter said that at the end of the book, there's a huge number of endnotes. It's all true. Anything you read on any page, any detail, any quote, you can look in the back of the book and see what my source is for that, whether it's a document or an interview. But I wanted it to read like a story about a handful of people. And one of the things that's great, my previous book was about China and Chinatown and migration patterns. And it was like this huge canvas. It was very hard for me to kind of pull these people together into a story because they were so disparate. And Northern Ireland is tiny. It's like a pinball machine. Small number of people, and they're constantly kind of bopping off each other, which for a writer is terrific because it means that you can do what I did, which is take like a half a dozen people and follow their story over 4 decades. And they keep interacting and intersecting. Many of them are friends at the beginning of the book and loathe each other by the end. And so the biggest choice that I made really to answer the question was to say, I need to narrow my focus. This is the story I'm going to tell. This does not need to be a 1,000-page history of the Troubles. Those books exist and they're good. And my hope is that there's a certain kind of person who wouldn't ever randomly pick up a 1,000-page history of Troubles, but might pick up this one because it's approachable. And once they get in, hopefully lured in by these characters, and they sort of get their bearings in this history, that on the other side of that, they'll read more deeply. And they will, at that point, pick up the more dense and comprehensive kind of works. So that was the hope.
Our next question comes from Lorraine Pirro. Have there been any formal attempts at healing like those in Rwanda and other conflicts? And if not, why not?
Oh, what a great question. I mean, there have been many informal attempts. There are many civil society groups. There are small efforts. The top-down efforts have been to the degree that they exist at all, have been a failure. Earlier, when I was talking about the this Boston College project, but basically when the conflict ended, this peace agreement was a little weird. It was a marvel of a peace agreement. It was amazing that it worked, but it was a compromise. And one of the things that they did was they hammered out this agreement that was basically purely forward-looking. It didn't have any account for like, what do we do about the past? So there was no South Africa style truth and reconciliation process. There was no, kind of Yugoslavia style, let's come up with a tribunal and figure out who we're going to try here, like who gets immunity and who gets tried. It was purely forward looking. And I think the reason for that was that if what to do with the past was like even on the table in the peace process, you would never have had a peace agreement because nobody could agree about what to do. And so as a result, you get this weird thing where at a certain point, people lay down their weapons and peace breaks out. But there's no agreement for like, how do we document what happened? Families that lost loved ones are left, not knowing why. In some instances, families that like where the state killed their civilian loved ones don't seem to have any recourse or can't get answers from the state. There are prosecutions here and there, but it's not systematic. And so anytime like British soldiers are, that there's a legal effort to kind of go after British soldiers for excessive force, then there's a question, well, why aren't you doing the same thing for Irish Republicans? Anytime you get, people going after I.R.A. members, they say, well, why aren't you doing this, going after the Loyalists? It becomes a very toxic situation. And if you go today, it's peaceful, but it's a brittle peace. The communities are very separate. I think this is a place that desperately needs precisely the kind of healing you're talking about and is not getting it.
Great question.
Great question. So our next question comes from I.House trustee Susan Stupin. How does the younger generation in Northern Ireland feel about these old conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, it's so fascinating. This is another, you'll notice a theme tonight, which is all of the ways in which I was clueless going in and slowly learned. When I started, again, with probably a very American Panglossian view of the world, I thought the good news is the younger generation is going to have no time for this whatsoever. That young people who grew up with the internet and could kind of see beyond, the four walls of their immediate existence would just never go in for this stuff, because who would? And I was wrong about that. I spent time over there, and there's a whole notion of kind of transgenerational trauma. There have been studies on this, but where you actually have, because a lot of this stuff hasn't been processed, you have children who are born there after the conflict ended and grow up in homes where they're surrounded by ghosts, where there's the sort of, they're haunted by violence and traumatized by that, even though they didn't experience it themselves. And July is a time when famously there are these big marches, these big sectarian marches. I went at one point in July, and it was terrifying. Yeah. They were like these young kids, 14, 15, 16 years old, drunk out of their minds, lighting bonfires, starting fights, engaging in kind of the worst sort of sectarian antagonism of one side or the other. And what a number of older people said to me is, the problem is these are kids they've grown up with all the ideology, but they don't have a sense of like, it's different for somebody who comes from the older generation where they knew that, your sister goes out to buy a dozen eggs and a bomb goes off and her leg gets blown off. And then you have a sister who's missing a leg, and that's a daily reminder of the cost of this. And there's a younger generation that maybe hasn't experienced that firsthand quite so much. So, I wish I was more optimistic. I do think a lot of it is very divorced from ideology. I think for these kids, it's like they're like soccer hooligans. Like they don't actually know about Anglo-Irish history, or Protestant or Catholic issues, or the disposition of the Good Friday Agreement, or any of these things that might be some ostensible ground for fighting. What they know is, we fly the Union Jack and you fly the tricolor, or vice versa. It's tribes. And I worry that particularly when you look at the fact that a lot of these people don't have great economic opportunities, that doesn't seem to be getting much better.
Okay, so the next question comes from Mary Beth Donahue. When I read your book, it seemed like it would be a great film or Netflix series. Any chance of that happening?
It is in the works.
Good.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see if it actually happens. I wouldn't want to jinx anything, but there are some very smart producers working on a limited series for FX right now. So fingers crossed.
Very cool. So I think we have time for one more question, but I just want to thank Wendy, Masha, Lorraine, Susan, and Mary for their wonderful questions. Our next question is from Guido. Have you seen the TV show Dairy Girls? And if so, what are your thoughts on the way the Troubles is presented as a backdrop, but not necessarily the focal point?
Yeah, I love this. It was a great question, and it's a very weird thing. You know, Dairy Girls, I don't know exactly when it came out vis-a-vis my book, but it's surprising the extent to which like people do both. They'll watch that show and read my book, or read my book and watch that show, and they're so different. But what's so great about that show is that it captures the way, like my book is about people in the I.R.A. The Troubles was everything for them. That was their life. You know, even today when you talk to them, it's still all they talk about because that was it. That was like the big show for them. But the reality is that in Northern Ireland, like for most people, it was this thing happening in the background. And I mean, at times it was obviously very disruptive. But it was this thing playing out. And what I love about that show is that it captures the way in which people are just, and this would be true in any conflict zone, anywhere you go. I remember I went to Israel in the middle of the Second Intifada, and I was in Israel and Jordan. And before I left, I was getting nervous or my parents were getting nervous, to be honest with you, because like the front page of the New York Times is just showing kind of fire and terror and craziness. And then you get there and people are living their lives. And, in my limited experience in places that are dealing with really severe conflict, this is often the case. So I think Dairy Girls captures that rather beautifully.
See, Asia, I wanted to ask a question, a good question Joan Gregory asked me last night.
Sure.
Are the economics, education, opportunity, have you seen any numbers? And how do the Catholics live in one area, Protestants? In Northern Ireland, has it gotten better for, people in general? And is there less discrimination and since the 1998 agreement?
Yeah, I mean, there's two answers to that question. I mean, when I said earlier that the conditions that existed prior to the Troubles or at the outbreak of the Troubles aren't there anymore, and so I think the likelihood of it breaking out again, is minimized for that reason. Yeah, there's much less discrimination. I think there's much greater equality between Catholics and Protestants now than there was before. And it's interesting because if you talk to Irish Republicans, they'll say like, see, we did it. But of course, it always begs the question, well, might that not have happened anyway? The more disturbing trend is that the Republic of Ireland it's had its ups and downs, but it's done really well in the last 20 years and has transformed as a country. And the North tends to lag behind the Republic economically. There are crazy numbers just recently, even on levels of COVID infection and COVID fatality, which in this tiny place, that it's so much worse in the North than it is in the Republic. So a lot of those types of inequalities continue to exist.
See, Asia, before we end, I wanted to know how many people, because I can't see, how many people were involved in it. I want Patrick to know, and I want to know how many people were listening to his great talk.
Yeah, right. So right now we're at 46 people, but we did have a few people in and out. So I think we were over 50. We have people from the New York area, DC. We have staff, trustees, and a few alumni joining us.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
And so this is, an experiment for us. And I think one day we've been talking about when we get you back in Davis Hall, we have those 500-600 residents who ask just brilliant questions. And then how we have this global community, and how do we also get them connected, involved? So this is sort of we're moving, to this digital age, and I just want to thank you. You are just a thoughtful and intellectually honest person, and I can't wait to read all the next stuff you've done. Amazing stuff on the Sacklers. I've read a lot of stuff you've done. So I hope everyone goes. If you haven't bought his book, I want Amazon servers crashing tonight. We want to keep him in the lifestyle he's become accustomed to. We want to make sure he can do these deep, important stories, because for our society, this kind of storytelling is so important, and having a press that can, educate. And in our society now, it seems like there's just these reductionistic black and white, and, with our media channels and everything. So to have someone like Patrick who can lay things out in such a complicated human way is such an important thing, and you keep at it, Patrick.
Oh, thank you, Peter, and thank you so much for this great conversation with you. Thank you, Sieja. Thank you all for joining us. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you for joining us, Patrick. Like Peter noted, we do hope that next time you're able to join us in person.
I love the sound of that. Thank you.
It was great to see some of you all, and thank you for joining the iHouse family. And we're coming back, and we will be, hopefully the vaccine will be, third, fourth quarter, and we're going to come back stronger than ever. So take care, everybody.